We're going to get started. I'm thrilled about the conversation that we're about to have here about state and local policy supports for regenerative farming and healthy soils. We have an incredible panel for you. To those checking in on the live stream, thank you for tuning in. And I want to introduce the moderator, MADDIE OATMAN from Mother Jones, one of our incredible media partners for this conference. She is an editor at Mother Jones, which is a political news magazine, and she is also the executive producer and co-host of BITE, which is Mother Jones's food policy podcast. So I'm going to let her take it away from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Well, I just really want to thank you all for having me. It's been such an honor. It's a huge honor to be up on stage here. And it's been wonderful just hearing a lot of your stories, so thank you for sharing them. So I want to start by asking you to raise your hand if you play a role in protecting soil in your state. Yeah, all of you, pretty much, because farmers are really the guardians and stewards of soil. The policy at the state level has been, and local level, has been very piecemeal and fragmented. And right after the Dust Bowl was when a lot of that got started. Roosevelt helped pass the Soil Conservation Act, which set up soil conservation districts, and there's still 3,000 of them across the country. And you'll see some of that kind of, the roots of some of the state policies are in that infrastructure that was started then. But since then, today in the Midwest, for instance, I think the Midwest alone has lost over half of its topsoil in just the last 50 years. So there's a lot of concern about soil health at the state level. And in 2016, California passed the Healthy Soils Initiative, which we may hear a bit more about. And other states have since passed policies to, a lot of them give funding to farmers for the work they're doing. And they also, California's, for instance, is helping the state try to meet its emissions targets, its emissions reductions targets. So, all that said, we are about to hear from 6 amazing panelists who are working at different levels on policy in their states. So, I want to begin by introducing Gail Taylor. Gail is the owner and operator of 3 Part Harmony Farm in Washington, D.C., and it is a vegetable farm. She also led a campaign that resulted in D.C. passing the Food Security Act of 2014, which is also known as D.C.'s Farm Bill. Give it up for Gail. In the middle here, the hot seat, we have Anthony Mint. He is a chef and co-founder of Mission Chinese Food, which is 3 restaurants now. He also founded TOODPRINT, which helps restaurants assess, reduce, and offset their carbon footprint. He's now working on something called Restore California, which is a private sector complement to a state program that funds farmers for sequestering carbon. And he'll talk more. Right here, I have DIDI Barrett, who is a New York State Assembly member in her 4th term, also former journalist. She has lived in the Hudson Valley for more than 30 years. In 2017, she introduced landmark legislation that she's going to talk about more, and in 2018, she secured funding for a pilot program that is monitoring soil carbon sequestration. And they are about to hear the results of that. So, very exciting.
Something like that.
All right, so to begin, I wondered if each of you could talk a little more about the strategy you are taking in the action that you're involved in, and why you chose that approach. So maybe I can start with you, Gail.
Sure, yeah. So I trained for 5.5 seasons working at an organic vegetable farm in Maryland, in Upper Marlboro, where I drove 20 miles to work at an organic farm that entire time and decided after a few years that it was just time to graduate and start my own farm. And the logical thing to do was to figure out how I could do that in DC where I was living. And so I did what many of you in this room maybe have done or are thinking about doing. I scouted land and I made a spreadsheet and went about the process of going from, and I wrote a business plan, and just went from top to bottom and figured out who owned the property and cold called owners and said, hey, what about me? Why don't you let me grow vegetables on your property? So I found this 2-acre parcel in Northeast DC that was owned by priests. It was perfect, almost perfectly square, already flat, already had a fence that I could lock the people from the street. Everything in every way was perfect, including that the priests were really on board and really wanted to let me grow vegetables there. But the main problem that we realized is that if they leased that property to 3 Part Harmony Farm, they were worried that the Office of Tax and Revenue was going to come after them for the taxes on that $5.2 million property, which would have been $50,000 a year. So I didn't start out deciding that I wanted to help co-write and pass a piece of legislation that would help other people be able to farm in DC. I basically just wanted to figure out how I could get a lease on the 2-acre property that I had my heart set on. And that just catapulted me into this whole it took 3 years to get this piece of legislation passed, in which I worked with law students from American University to try to do research to see how other jurisdictions had done a similar thing, right? You have the basic same problem everywhere in this country. You want to grow vegetables on a piece of property that's cost prohibitive because of the way that the taxes are assessed. And so all you have to do is change the way that taxes are assessed on that property. And every other state has done this already. It's just that DC, hopefully you all know this, is not a state. And so we had to make our own bill.
So I began in the restaurant industry by doing pop-ups before that term even existed. And then that turned into a permanent pop-up in a Chinese restaurant called Mission Chinese Food. We always had a charitable agenda, and we were helping the food bank raise money. We've helped raise over 1 million meals for the food bank. My friend and business partner, great chef, moved to New York, and he opened another version of Mission Chinese, or another location, in basically like a shitty Thai takeout window with a plywood beer garden attached to it. And it won New York Times Restaurant of the Year in 2012. And so like we ended up in this, almost like backdooring in this celebrity chef world of like, having a beer with the #1 chef in the world, or like kicking a soccer ball around with the #2 chef in the world. And then 7 years ago, my wife and I had a daughter, and we started to think more about the food system and climate change and nutrition, and really realizing like, man, we should try to use our platform to make a difference here. And we did that in a few different ways, but one way in particular was opening a restaurant called The Perennial. And we were trying to tell the story of regenerative agriculture. We had a whole animal beef butchery program serving carbon ranched beef from Stemple Creek Ranch, which is a pilot of the Marine Carbon Project. I'll digress for a moment because I can't help myself, but they were doing compost application and managed grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing on the whole ranch. Compost plus managed grazing on 1/10 of the ranch. That pilot project on the 10th of the ranch, after 5 years, has already sequestered as much carbon as not burning 1 million gallons of gas. So we're trying to tell this story. We're baking bread from a perennial grain called kernza, which a lot of you may know already. And basically, we would tell this story and consumers wouldn't necessarily get it. It was hard to even get people to pay an extra $1 for these kinds of things. And so that kind of failure, essentially, to like really create systems change through sourcing well, solely through sourcing well, kind of helped inform our approach now, which is to try to essentially aggregate a few cents from meals at any restaurant and use that to shift as many acres as possible from extractive to renewable farming. And so you could sort of think of this in the same way as like when a utilities company asks you to, pay $5 a month to improve the grid. And, you can opt out, and next year the grid will be 36% renewable, and next year it'll be 41% renewable. And basically, the food system needs this kind of way for people to seamlessly improve the food system directly, and I don't think it has it. And so we're trying to improve the grid of food.
So I'm Assemblymember DIDI Barrett, and I represent the 106th Assembly District. For those of you who live in New York, it's roughly the southern part of Columbia County and the northern part of Dutchess County, so kind of further up the Hudson Valley. And it's a very agricultural area. And since I was first elected, I have been very conscious and conscientious about supporting agriculture. I mean, it's the legacy of this region, but it's also the future of this region. So I've been very committed to supporting in whatever ways that I could, very cognizant of the fact that agriculture is really 20 to 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions, is responsible for that much of greenhouse gas emissions when we're looking at the climate issues. So what I've been attracted to are the areas that are the confluence of agriculture and climate, so environmental and agricultural nexus. And had some really extraordinary farmers in my district who were doing some very interesting work in carbon. And being a mother, I would listen to many of the approaches to climate remediation, carbon fees, carbon taxes, carbon penalties, all of that sort of negative approach, and felt like there's got to be a more positive carrot approach to incentivizing good agricultural practices that aren't all about penalizing people for doing things that we know are really bad. And actually, just kind of ironically, sitting with Abby Rockefeller at a dinner she owns some properties and farms up in my area, and brainstorming together about it. And I remember literally saying to her, what if we found a way to incentivize farmers to sequester carbon, to practice the kinds of sort of really time-honored, but still very not so much in practice, agricultural practices like no-till or cover cropping or planting trees in pasture land. And we went back and kind of worked up a bill and introduced, as MADDIE said, the Carbon Farming Act in 2017. And that resulted in, nothing happens too fast, but we started the conversation going. And it started with some money in the state budget, $50,000 for Cornell to do a study to look at the issues that we were raising. So the main, issues were, how do you measure carbon? How do you monetize the carbon? What if somebody's been doing this for decades or centuries and you're not going to see as much change? How do you incentivize? How do you figure out how much money those farmers would get compared to somebody who has taken, a toxic field and turned it around completely? So these are the subjects that we are continuing to have. This study is underway or it should be done. We're supposed to be hearing from Cornell. I think we were supposed to actually be hearing in November. But being a kind of impatient person, I turned around and said, well, what if we do this in a more compressed region and do a pilot project, which is what Maddie was referring to. So we got money in the last state budget. A senator who also represents a new senator from the other side of the river was very interested in her counties being involved. So my 2 counties, Dutchess and Columbia, and her 3, Ulster, Orange, and Sullivan, are part of this pilot that we got $400,000 in the last state budget to embark on. We're hoping in the next planting season that this will be underway. The idea is to have about 8 farms, diversity of farms, because we have that in the Hudson Valley. We have everything from the black dirt farms with that are mostly onion and potato to fruit and dairy and vegetable, livestock, and we really want to have a range of farms involved in this. The soil and water districts are running this farm, so we come back to that partner, and so I felt that my opportunity was to use my role in state government to start making change happen, and that's what we did.
So I want to actually drill down a little bit into the approaches that some of these policies that you've referenced take, and I have to credit Connor Steadman, who had a fabulous carbon farming panel yesterday, for helping think through this question. But basically, there's a bit of a debate going on about how to incentivize practices that that protect soil and sequester carbon. And on one side, some of these policies are creating grants for farmers that often pay farmers for the practices, the ways that they're treating the soil, planting cover crops, applying compost, and then you have another structure which pays farmers directly for the services by the quantity of carbon that they are sequestering, which it sounds like is more how the New York legislation is geared. It's paying, for instance, per ton of carbon sequestered.
That is still the open question. I mean, that is partly what the initiative from that Cornell was supposed to come back, because that study was done in combination with the State Department of Tax and Finance, as well as the Department of Environmental Conservation and Ag and Market. So the idea was to get those 3 state agencies together and figure out the best formula. We started out initially thinking about a credit, because that's always an easier bite. I'm not convinced, because if you're not making enough money to take a tax credit, you're not going to benefit from it. So, completely sympathetic to that issue. So I think we're still open on exactly how to structure that. And, Connor was actually part of us developing this bill in the first place, and he's been a great ally and partner all along with it. And I, continue to be open, watching other states, and, certainly what Anthony's doing here is creating another whole source, we haven't even talked about that yet, but a whole other source of revenue that, that I think would be ideal for us to look at as well.
So Anthony, could you talk a little bit more about the strategy you're taking and kind of that?
Yeah, for sure.
Those directions.
So we were running this restaurant, The Perennial, trying to walk the walk and source well and, lead by example. And at the same time, we had a nonprofit project called Zero Foodprint, and that was essentially working with restaurants. They would do a life cycle assessment, learn about their carbon footprint, maybe make changes, and become carbon neutral, primarily through offsets. As this soil carbon science basically was like really advancing, and carbon farming protocols passed on the American Carbon Registry, we tried to buy the credits. And it just seemed like, great, these carbon neutral restaurants can buy the carbon credits for better farming, everything's going to work out. And then basically I was on the phone with them and they said, well, there's not going to be credits. I was like, well, why not? That wasn't the protocol approved. Yeah, it was approved, but you got to test like all these to make true carbon credits on the carbon market, you're going to test many things. Soil changes every year, blah, blah, blah. This is going to create credits that cost $200 a ton, on the carbon market. Credits are like $5 or $10 per ton. So there's a huge gap because of the testing. I mean, never mind even how carbon markets work and if anybody even buys those carbon credits and things. That's a whole different issue. But just the fit with monitoring and the cost and verification and overhead of creating offsets, it really made me think that rather than focus a lot of energy on the monitoring, we really just needed to send the resources towards the actual actions. And our particular niche, which is in restaurants, it falls in this economic sweet spot, I believe, where, if a restaurant was trying to go carbon neutral by making contributions, let's say, to help a farmer apply compost or plant cover crop seeds or something, if you tested it and got the exact amount of carbon that's sequestered and all these things, the diner at the restaurant, would it really make a difference if they were, if they had a $30 meal and they were sending 18 cents versus 21 cents, to that effort? I don't really think that is at the heart of it. And so we kind of shifted our model entirely to just say, on the one hand, you can participate in this movement by being carbon neutral, or you can just simply add a 1% charge on the check and just send that all to the carbon farming project. And really what gave us the freedom and the credibility to do that is that the state of California wanted to create more funding for carbon farming. And so they agreed to partner on this and make it like a public-private collaboration on a statewide program. And so now it's not just some guy running a Chinese restaurant saying hey, add a 1% charge on the check and send it to a farm. It's the state government, of the world's 5th largest economy, saying let's do that and solve the problem.
And so how would a farmer qualify to receive funding? Because they're not measuring the exact number.
So in California, since there is this Healthy Soils program, there's a whole applicant pool. There's also, so in California, it's called the Resource Conservation Districts. And, we were talking to people at the RCDs, and they said there's already 60 carbon farm plans that are completed. Farmers are just waiting for money to implement them. There's no money. And so that's, these are all applicants that could just receive funds. And getting into the nitty-gritty, they can basically just submit a simple application I'm this farm, I'm at this address, I would like to apply compost on 40 acres. I'm seeking $16,000. And so instead of a pay per ton model, which, might work for some farms, might not work for others, through consultation with the RCDs, we basically decided, really what it should be is just farmers should name their price. And then there's a reverse auction, essentially, among all the applicants, and the pool will just fund the best project, the next best project, the most efficient project that is taking in the most carbon per dollar, basically, except for in a case where a chef or a restaurant wants to directly fund their own farmer, in which case, as long as the project is in the top half of that queue, then they can just choose their own farmer.
So all three of you are involved in shaping policy, or have been in one way or the other. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the biggest challenge that that you've come across doing this work, and maybe, Gail, I can kick it back to you.
I think the biggest challenge for me in doing this policy work is how slow everything goes, and you talked about that a little bit. And full disclosure, before I was a farmer, I was a grassroots organizer, and I did a lot of policy work lobbying on Capitol Hill on a grassroots level. So my paid job was to get people to write to their members of Congress and talk to them about bills that we should pass to make the world a better place. And I got into farming so that I could go out there and make the world a better place, and that I didn't have to go through that intermediary anymore. So when I found myself in this situation where the only way to do what I wanted to do was to find a legislator to help me pass a piece of legislation, it was very ironic. yeah, and it took 3 years because the process is just so slow. You have to convince everybody and go through all of the hoops and get everybody on board. I worked with 2 city council members who didn't want to introduce our legislation until they were sure that we would have a unanimous vote, which in the end we did. But that part for me is really hard, that it takes a long time, and in the meantime, I feel like I have these kinds of questions like, should we keep on going down that path even though they move so slow? Or should we kick it back to the private sector and let's just ask the customers? Like, do you believe that farmers have this solution? And do you think that, if you paid 5 cents more, whatever that kind of tax is at the restaurants where you eat, and give it directly into the hands of the people who already know what to do, wouldn't that be so much better? I think sometimes there's certainly, obviously for me, I've done both ways, and I think it's just always important to try to sit back and weigh those pros and cons of like, yeah, if you're gonna go the route of working with the politicians, the legislators, you have to be like recognizing it's gonna take a long time and the end result might not be where you started. And at the end of the day, ultimately, I believe in the power of the people. And I think that it's important to remember that policy work is one tool in your toolkit. But going out there and being on the streets and making real change, starting your own farm, putting seeds into the ground, that's actually also an equally powerful thing for people to be doing.
What other challenges have you?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for what you do, and thank you for including me in this panel and being here. But I mean, I think that you are the next generation and the current generation of putting food on the tables of families, and healthy food, and that is a service that doesn't get recognized and doesn't get supported. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we have, that agriculture, the cost of food is not the way we look at what food really costs, is not how we measure what we give to farmers, what we pay for food, what we invest in the infrastructure. We do it really wrong in this country. We subsidize putting corn in our gas tanks, or we don't subsidize the really important work that's being done to feed people and to feed diverse people around the world. So that, I think, is the biggest challenge, that even when we first did this, people would laugh, ha ha, carbon farming, what do you, growing carbon? People don't, they don't recognize, first of all, we know that almost half the population in this country still doesn't recognize that climate change is a real issue. But then when you put it with agriculture, they don't accept that this is what it costs to grow healthy food. And I think that is something that I hope that as farmers that you will continue to push back and try to educate your consumers about. It's really important that consumers become those people who are the advocates.
So do you have thoughts on how young farmers such as these can have their voices amplified in this conversation? You talked about how a lot of this work is sometimes invisible, but when it comes down to shaping the policies that really do affect the people sitting in this room doing this work, how have you made sure to connect with people kind of?
Well, how many of you have direct contact with consumers, with the people who are buying and eating your food? Most of you. So, I mean, I think that is an important, I think that's a, profound relationship. And that, when I first was elected to the legislature, I'm the first, and I know this is supposed to be nonpartisan, I'm the first Democrat to represent the area. The majority in the Assembly is Democratic, but most of the members have been from downstate, so New York City. So I was sort of able to come to this group and say, my constituents are feeding your constituents, because my farmers are going to New York City farmers markets or creating CSAs that were selling to the city. And that became really a powerful dynamic that in many cases it was moms, but it was, families that cared what they put on their their family's table and where that food was coming from, and the things that we have been able to do in New York State on preservation of farmland and support of young farmers. The National Young Farmers Coalition is headquartered in my district in Hudson, and we've done some great bills with them. I think those relationships are really essential, and getting to know your legislators and being able to, to reach out to them to help make those changes happen, I think are really important. It's like we all have to do multiple things. We can't just do the work that we do. We have to do the work and then advocate for the work. So you all have to be kind of lobbyists, or at least have a connection to the people who are making policy, I think, too.
Any tips over here? You were Gail, a farmer, but then also helped, campaign and write.
Yeah, I talk a lot about this because the story of the piece of legislation that I helped write and pass, and then the story of me starting my own farm, they go hand in hand, and it's part of my own journey of even traveling to the place where I decided that I wanted to be a grower. And so for me, part of it was like I was on this path to discover what it was that I wanted my contribution in the world to be, and how I saw myself as a person living in solidarity with all of the people around me. And so my participation in this entire process of, seeing that there needed to be this piece of legislation that then we passed was a very personal thing. And it wasn't that I read about something in the newspaper, some issue, and thought that was exciting and I wanted to get involved in it. Like literally without this piece of legislation, I wouldn't have the lease on the property where I farm. And I think that has to be true in some way for all of us. It has to be for you, and you have to be asking yourself, what is it about my situation right now that is not allowing me to fulfill my dream of what I want to do, and how can I change that? And if that means that there's a missing law in your city that you need to help write and create, then you do that. And in whatever way that it's going to help you be able to fulfill that mission and that vision in your life, just like first and foremost, recognizing your own agency in that and realizing that the entire process for you is about getting to the place where you want to be to live a fulfilled life. That's just for me the most important, of like making it personal. That's the only way. You have to see like this is directly related to the way that you are claiming your own identity in this movement and in this community. And so every single step that you take is about that, and every single person who goes with you on that journey, including, the city council member who introduced the piece of legislation, I knew his family. And there's not a single part of my story that is like, can't be demystified and can't be replicated by every single person in this room. It wasn't that I had some magic sauce. I sat with a group of friends and I mapped out where I wanted to be in 5 years. And as part of my homework in this journey of being in this group that we called a Dream Accountability Group, I had to write down who all of the people in my community were who had information or knowledge or access. And I went through line by line and just called everybody, contacted everybody who was in my circle until I had created that group that became, the ones that took this legislation all the way until it got passed unanimously. And I can't say it too many times, every single person in this room, you can do that. It doesn't have to be like, I want to pass a farm bill in my city, whatever it is. The whole point is like you are doing it with your community, and you are all bringing your own strengths to the table to make that happen.
That's a really good idea. Can you talk more about, so you identified a problem, and can you be even more specific about how the writing and the, communicating that message, how that went?
Yeah, so like I said before, I had one problem, and it's the same problem everybody has. I wanted to farm on a piece of property that was too expensive. I live in a city where condos and liquor stores restaurants are going up everywhere. There's no affordable housing, and you certainly can't afford to plant cucumbers on a $5 million property. And so I just looked around at the way that other people had done it from the 70s and the 80s. All kinds of models existed where jurisdictions had created an ag exemption that calculated the taxes of the property taxes of land in agricultural use at different rates. So I found some law students who wanted to do research to see what does that mean in North Carolina, what did that mean in Michigan, what did it mean in all of these states, and then how we could make that applicable to our city. And that meant seeing like maybe in one state, the agricultural exemption is based on the dollar amount that you sell. That's how you get defined as a farm. Or in another state, maybe your agricultural status is based on how many acres you farm. And so we just had to make that applicable to our own situation. It had to be able to go across whatever anybody else who came after me wanted to do. So I only knew how to grow vegetables in soil, and that's what I set out to do. But maybe somebody else wanted to grow on a roof. Maybe somebody else wanted to do mushrooms. Maybe somebody else wanted to have a hydroponic business. I don't care. Whatever everybody wants to do and call it a farm, we needed to write a piece of legislation that would incorporate all of those dreams, because when you're doing this work and it takes that long, you only get one shot, right? It's not like 2 years later we were going to write Farm Bill addendum. So it had to be like comprehensive. It had to fit in what everybody was going to do, and everybody had to come to the table and do it together.
Anthony, so you went from kind of operating a restaurant and thinking in that mode, and then now you're sort of working kind of on the state level or in companion with the state. And can you just talk a little bit about that shift and what you maybe could share with people who are thinking bigger than their own farm?
Sure. When I started doing a pop-up, the impulse was kind of like, oh, why doesn't someone just do this XYZ thing? And so I think that same impulse is kind of what is driving this. Is like, oh, why don't we just create a system where some money goes back to create the food system we want to see? Like the fact that the food system is not renewable is like almost completely insane. And so I think one area that we didn't really touch on in terms of policy, but is like a really huge opportunity, especially supported by some of the new science, is around compost. And so like I really think that, just imagine if like hundreds of years from now, aliens visit Earth and they would look at this place and say like, oh, here's this planet where every molecule of organic matter went back into nature, except for the whole food production system of the humans. They wrapped it in plastic bags, locking it out of nature, and it created methane, and then they went extinct. And like, that's crazy. So to me, it's like, among other things, why not just, as farmers, work on compost legislation to get all the compost back onto their farms, or just, really anything. And so part of what has really been eye-opening to me, learning about a lot of like climate solutions and all these things, is that the problem is totally solvable, and it is really the thing that is keeping it from happening is money. And so like there's people, marching, millions of people march, do something about climate, and they have the power to do something themselves just with money. And I think we don't even embrace that opportunity because there's a lack of education about how possible it is. So that's why I have this book drawn on here, because Connor was referring to it yesterday, but 300 climate experts did this kind of estimate of plausibility and carbon that could come out of the atmosphere in their own areas of expertise. So for solar farms, for wind turbines, for educating girls, for regenerative agriculture. And overall, the whole study just shows we could solve it for 1% of GDP. And overall, the study shows that there's a public benefit of like $2.50 or $3 per dollar to do it. You should do it just to make money somehow. So why not? And then with carbon farming, the benefit is $30 per dollar. And so to me, that there's like a huge opportunity for a win-win politically, financially, and we just need to find out how to do that. And in part, that's why the monitoring becomes less important to me, because it's like there's a 30-to-1 benefit here. Like there's a little room for like a confidence interval and a little uncertainty.
So I'm about to open it up for questions, so please get your questions primed. But as a last question, I just kind of wondered what it is that you want. All of you are in positions of power at different levels and shaping policy. What is it that you want to hear from farmers where you are, and how do they get that message to you?
On this issue, or just in general, what do we want to hear from farmers?
I guess on this issue, but.
Well, what I would like to hear is, is that farmers are interested in, exactly doing what, what Anthony was talking about, and engaging in the full cycle and working with us in partnership to make it happen. I mean, what I love about what he's doing is basically all the restaurants in my area are farm to table. Well, it's time to come back and do table to farm, and and make that full cycle. And but I, obviously wanting farmers engaged in the process with us, and in conversation, and in helping us understand what we need, what we can do better to to create the the regulations or the deregulations to to facilitate all that. So.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like farmers clearly want it to. Should we do a show of hands of like how many farmers in the room would want to receive funds to apply compost and plant cover crops and implement more sustainable practices? That's like every single farmer wants that, and so it's just like how do we make that into the new reality?
I think that what I want is for farmers to, and myself included, to feel appreciated and valued. I work for our Chesapeake Region Sustainable Ag Association called Future Harvest. We were talking about this before. We're just getting ready to launch a 1 Million Acre Challenge, which is going to send 1 million acres of farmland in Maryland to regenerative practices, and we're doing soil benchmarking studies too. One of the things that we are noticing in our region is just this, like, we're in this market trend change now among sustainable farmers, where it's like, I feel like we got pretty good at coming to a conference and sitting in a workshop and going home and growing better carrots. And we know how to do all of these things, how to rebuild healthy soils, how to sequester carbon. I don't think that the consumer base is giving us back the love that we're putting out. And I really feel like I see that pain sometimes. Like, we just really wish people wouldn't need it to be explained all the time. Like, we already saved the planet for your children. And you need us to teach you how to cook that kohlrabi too. Yeah, I think, I don't know where that would come from. I don't know what policy can change that or how to transform people's minds. But my deepest wish is for us to figure out how to get there, where the farmers are applauded when we walk into the room. People understand the importance of where their food comes from.
Well, thank you. We've left a lot of time open for your questions, and so please ask them more about the process, or whatever. Right here.
Wait, can you wait for the mic? Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. And if you wouldn't mind saying your name and where you are based, that would be great. Sure.
My name is Kyle, and I'm based at the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps in Richmond, Vermont. And you all alluded sort of to the amount of time that it took for you to do your project. Would you be able to speak to how much time that, or your timeline for your work?
Are you done?
Am I done? No, I mean, well, with California, we first had a discussion about it in February, and then they basically wanted to move really quickly to make an announcement around Earth Day, so they announced it. But then now we're sort of just like still forming the plan of it. It's very hard to get meetings and make things happen. But I mean, that's another lesson, is like, who knew that the reason policy was formed was because someone had an occasion and just needed to announce.
For Earth Day.
I could have told you that. So was your question, I didn't hear what the question part of it was.
It's more just trying to understand how long your process has taken and where maybe you're still seeing the timeline go.
So I would say, you know, I kind of started this in 2017 and that first bill, and then I mean, different things have happened as a result. And in fact, listening to Gail, it just reminded me, we are actually also now in the process of working with a delegate from Maryland and possibly somebody from one of the legislators from Vermont, and looking at a model around soil health in farming and in forestry that would be regional, multi-states, kind of like a RGGI or, you know, there's a current transportation climate initiative. So we've got a working meeting coming up later this month, and I think so. Every step it gets a little better and it gets a little more. We get more going on, and I'm very excited to go back and reach out to restaurants and caterers in my area and ask for their 1% and make this happen. So.
And you said it was about something like a multi-year campaign that you worked on?
I started in 2012, and the piece of legislation we introduced was passed in December of 2014, so it was about 3 seasons that I went through. We introduced a companion legislation when the Farm Bill was introduced that created a food policy council. So in 2015, DC started its first food policy council that has several subgroups, including an urban agriculture subgroup. But the truth is the Food Policy Council has not implemented any of the Farm Bill, and so none of the specific requirements in the legislation that I helped write have been implemented, except for the line item that says that an exempt property owner can pass that exemption on to their farmer, and so that line item was written for me. And I was the first and now the only farm in DC to get a lease from the legislation. So that's kind of like an unfortunate, subtext to the entire story, is that I set about trying to create this thing that would help other people. And now everyone is still waiting for the DC government to pass the regulations and do all of the appropriate implementation of these policy work. And the truth is it's because nobody in the city government knows anything about farming. They don't know anything about how to make a lease agreement. The Office of Tax and Revenue didn't really understand how to create a separate piece of paper for a property owner to apply for this tax abatement that got passed. And so there are just all of these problems that they have been facing, and now they decided recently to open an Office of Urban Agriculture, and they are in the process of hiring its first director. So maybe in the year 2020, DC will start implementing some of the other pieces of the legislation. I wish I had a better answer for you. I didn't hold my breath.
Questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Amy from Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, and I guess this is for Anthony. On our island, there's been an initiative where it's a food waste recovery initiative, where mostly, predominantly, restaurant food waste is collected. Other families can also go to, locations to drop off food waste, but basically a nonprofit farm organization on the island then composts it, so it stays on the island. And I'm just wondering if that is something that would be scalable is that something that is someone from a restaurant background thought of?
I can't speak towards that specific initiative, but I mean, that's a great model for any community, and it seems like it speaks towards the potential of like public-private partnerships, because maybe the board of supervisors of the island or whoever wanted to to do compost collection, but they didn't have enough funding to do the whole thing. And then the fact that somebody else steps up and kind of fills half the gap then makes it like, okay, then we'll just require people to do it or whatever. But I think that there's a lot of potential for situations like that to create compost infrastructure anywhere.
But
Maybe
do you
Didi can speak
see, I know that, for example, a lot of the participating restaurants, it adds a burden on them in terms of, separating out the different food waste that is, acceptable or not. But I mean, I guess I'm out wondering what would be the obstacles to making that happen, more broadly.
It's true there's a burden and there's a challenge, like possibly even here at Blue Hill there's a challenge. It's always a challenge kind of, but you can always, eventually create the culture that we want. Like, recycling didn't start until relatively recently and still isn't happening everywhere. So, I mean, I think it's a work in progress, but that's not a reason not to start.
New York City apartment buildings are collecting compost. I mean, this is not undoable. It's just like every conversation, as Anthony said, it's like, oh, how are we going to ever stop using plastic bags? I mean, many of us grew up before there were plastic bags, and that's changing. Habits change. I think it's just really, it's kind of, making it a priority and understanding what the downside of not doing it is, which is not so good.
And the California Healthy Soils Initiative does include compost application as one of the practices that qualify you as a farmer to receive funding for the soil conservation and carbon sequestration you're doing. So you could kind of imagine if you already have that level of the policy, if you could kind of extend it to encompass the people producing the compost and incentivizing that. I mean, I don't know if that's been part of...
We haven't looked at that yet, but that certainly it should be. I mean, I think that makes sense, yeah.
It's more about the food waste recovery,
I'm coming for you. Right here. Hi, I'm Maria Skimmerhorn from Delhi, New York, and in the light of the food waste, I actually have a small business that I've started collecting food waste from restaurants and households and events and different things. And there's like, you were saying funding for like farms to apply compost, but it's hard to get funding for those that are collecting the food waste to produce the compost. And there's a lot of, because we're a very rural area, there's a lot of travel involved. So there's a lot of those issues, as well as land, finding land, because like we're using a private property right now, and we've outgrown the private property, and we need more land, but there isn't a lot of land available. So like those types of things, I don't know if there's anything.
Certainly, I mean, we had a conversation earlier with Anthony, and it started me thinking about compost, but it's also Tom McCarthy, my legislative director, is here. I hope taking notes on all of these ideas. So yeah, I'm definitely very interested in looking at what we could be doing more in New York to encourage composting and support it at every step of the way. So thank you for sharing that.
Hi, Jesse Smith from Santa Barbara, California. Anthony, I've been watching you develop this program for the last year or so, and it's amazing to see where it's come. My question is around the receptivity of chefs chefs in restaurants to fund a program, and whether you found it's helped by an affiliation with a government institution or it's hindered. I believe everyone up there has mentioned kind of the bureaucratic hurdles that come with money or energy flowing through the government. And so where do you find that balance between either keeping it a private operation where they're directly funding farmers or going through a government program, and have you found a place to actually hold the money and distribute the money, and who's the third party that is kind of addressing where it goes and how we're quantifying, people's value?
Yeah, a lot of great questions. So the first one, how's the reception? The restaurant industry is impossible. Like, we lose money, we barely make money, we want to pay people more, we're overworked. And I closed 2 restaurants this year, and so it's not an easy task to like walk up to a chef and say like, hey, I have an idea, why don't you just, give $20,000 to a farmer? It's like crazy. But in a way, it's kind of like, at some point, I think the culture will shift to where this would be viewed as an opportunity for the customer and an opportunity to do something. And so like, in some ways, the better question is, what's the reception among customers? And so at Mission Chinese, we started doing this a year ago, and for various reasons, we went ahead and just made it a 3% charge. I wanted to kind of stress test it and hear what people said and stuff. We've probably served like 35,000 people in the past year, and one party of 2 has opted out, and one party of 4. And so granted, it's a little bit of a dark and loud party restaurant, so maybe people aren't noticing every time, but it's still like, if they're not noticing, then that also just speaks towards like, then it's not a big deal. But so the question about the government affiliation, I could never ask for that much money from a restaurant without that. There's no way. And so that's huge, and again, speaks towards the potential for public-private collaborations in general. Prior to that, our model was I got into it a little bit, but using the framework of carbon neutrality as the justification for doing it. And that's still relevant too. Like you could try to do your part based on your environmental impact, or you could try to do your part based on kind of your economic opportunity. And then, sorry, there was one last thing. Oh, the money, where the money is. So for us, the money goes into a bank account at Beneficial State Bank, which is a social impact bank run by Tom Steyer, Democratic presidential nominee or whatever, candidate, sorry, and Kat Taylor, a regenerative grazing research ranch, and they've just signed a disclosure agreement so that they're allowed to kind of say what is happening with the bank account money. And so, it's as simple as they'll just blog about where it goes. And so, in terms of like how someone would consider it, the money's not actually going through the government, and that actually, if you're like anti-government or something, that maybe makes it easier. And again, is like one of the benefits of a public-private collaboration, because there can just be full transparency and it can go really quickly and stuff. Thanks.
Can I ask a question? So, you all are working at the state and municipal level, which was by design in terms of this panel, and I was just wondering if you can kind of think out, because we are about to enter a presidential election year, as you've just alluded to, Anthony, how different can you imagine life being working? You've all sort of worked against the odds locally to make these incredible things happen. What in your dreamscape of sort of federal supports for this kind of work and a sort of alliance with the federal government that was oriented towards solving these problems, what would you be looking forward to, if such a thing existed?
Aligning financial incentives with healthy soil instead of doing the complete opposite. I don't know how that works with the Farm Bill, but
it's time for a new Farm Bill.
Yeah.
A whole new approach. I think small and mid-sized farms should be getting the support that that Big Ag has been getting. I keep saying I believe here in the Hudson Valley we have the model for the future of agriculture. It's not the square states. It's it's not the subsidies for just for corn and soybeans and commodities that we're looking for markets for. I mean, I think there's so many other ways to do this in economically and environmentally sustainable way that it would be obviously a dream to have a federal government that got that and was supportive of it and ran with it.
And whether or not they would follow through, Pete Buttigieg in the last debate mentioned paying farmers for soil carbon sequestration. Cory Booker's talked about it, and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have both talked about it. So it is kind of, I find it pretty fascinating that it's actually entering into the presidential, at least the primary debate conversation. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and I think, Al Gore has actually done a great deal, and he's walking the walk in Tennessee, and I think he's made, his stature has made it much more on the radar screen of a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily, so that's been good too. We remember Al Gore, right?
We have one here. Hi. This is kind of a light question, but that green, the perennial green you were talking about, is called kernza. How does it taste?
Great. It's got a slightly grassy note because it's originally a perennial wheatgrass called Phenoprium, I think, that they've been breeding for decades or 15 years or something, naturally breeding to get better culinary properties and higher yield and integration with machinery. So, I mean, you can now get like beer and in some cases flour from certain people or something. There's a chef, Ken, from Epiphany Farm, who amazingly I was talking to him earlier today, and he's like, yeah, I know kernza, we're growing some on my farm. And so it's starting to become available. So you could ask him how it tastes. The interesting thing is that I think it tastes different in each region because the roots go so deep that like it has a totally different like terroir and flavor profile and everything.
Last question. We have one. Nope.
How did Kurt Erickson, Vermont Compost, I'm curious, so anytime you're navigating legislation or trying to get anything like this done, one of the most challenging things is the people part of it, and trying to bridge some gaps and, educate folks and all of that. So what would you advise anyone else here that's kind of, maybe taking a parallel path in terms of the, how you get people to support what you're going for and how you, kind of get the support that you need, or, in city council, I'm sure there were probably some people that are, the initial reaction is like, I don't have time for this, but kind of just getting the people behind you and on board with what you're doing. What could you tell us about that, or some lessons that you've learned?
I think having a broad base is important. So I mentioned before that I worked with a lot of different groups and especially included the voices of farmers who were farming in different ways than I was to make sure that we were using the right language to be all inclusive. I also, like in the last push in the end process, recruited a nonprofit organization that's based in DC that focuses on access to healthy food because that's a really important issue in our city. And not that it's not important to me, but I didn't have this huge machine behind, making food accessible and working with DCPS, working with the public school system. So that ended up being a really important partnership that I developed with that nonprofit called DC Greens. And they were the ones that helped us craft the pieces of legislation that also spoke specifically to like farmers getting tax credits for donating vegetables to soup kitchens and things like that. The other part too is when you develop a broad base, you have to make compromises, which means maybe getting rid of things that are too controversial. The city council member that introduced our legislation really wanted to have chickens in his backyard. And everybody on his staff had to tell him, that bill's not going to get passed this time. We got to take it out and try later. And so, you know, you kind of have to like sometimes take one for the team, I guess. Not everything can all go together and still have that unanimous support.
Any thoughts on that?
For me, I'm in the restaurant industry, so I almost feel like it's been an incredible advantage in terms of like getting a meeting with someone to just be like, hey, I'll like buy you lunch, like come, you know, whatever. It sounds ridiculous.
Bring food.
But yeah, it's like, sometimes that is all it takes, or just like having someone else have a similar viewpoint and ask the same person the same thing, but just one more person or whatever, like, even if they're not, you know, if they're not like a diehard and it's not their mission, they might still like write that email for you. And so just having it come from multiple directions and stuff.
I would say two thoughts. One is bring food. I mean, who wouldn't love when you came with a basket of whatever it is that, you know, not compost necessarily, but maybe, I mean, the right people. But also, I think, you know, talk amongst yourselves. I mean, I think that there's a lot of interesting things happening in different states, and, you know, I'm very admiring of what the National Young Farmers Coalition has done in different states, and even the legislation. You know, it may not work exactly the same way in New York as it did in, you know, Massachusetts or Colorado or something, but there's stuff that you can get from each other. So I would say, learn from the way other people have, especially on a, you know, a particular issue, and then look for the allies in your own community who, you know, who can help you. I think people are more approachable than you think they're going to be, and, you know, I think there's a lot of allies. Maybe they're more in the environmental side than in the farm side, but if they're caring about sustainability, they're going to want to hear what you have to say. So I think we can learn a lot from each other on these issues.
Thank our panelists. I think we're going to move into dinner now.